Distinguished guests, colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to present the cognitive warfare concept to you. I must say it's a great honor to be here. I've been observing the CyCon from the sidelines for many years, and it's a pleasure to be here and speak from the same stage as so many great speakers this week. I need to control this thing. The topic I'll present is less pure cyber than most of the presentations this week, but I hope I can convince you that it's highly relevant also for this community. Hence the tagline, hacking the OODA loop, that I hope will resonate with this audience. Those of you with military background at least will know that the OODA loop, or the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act loop, is the conceptual model for human decision-making by the US Air Force Colonel and fighter pilot John Boyd. At a high level, what we're exploring through this concept is how our adversaries can hack or disrupt our OODA loop, and how, conversely, we can hack or defend and enhance it. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because not everyone is nerding out about concepts every day like I do, I thought I'd provide this overview of NATO documents and how concepts fit into this. It's a little simplified, but for the purposes of this presentation, I think it does the job. On a side note, I was very happy to see that the incoming COE director, in his keynote the first day, promoted the NATO CDNE method and the handbook that we published at ACT. So I encourage everyone that does CDNE to use that, and thank you so much, sir, for promoting that. Now, many of you are familiar with the high-level NATO documents listed at the top here, and the NATO strategic concept that has been referenced several times this week, and of course is being prepared for a new version at the NATO summit in Madrid in just a couple of weeks. To make the confusion complete, the NATO strategic concept is not a military concept as I'm discussing today, but rather a very high policy level document that sits just below the North Atlantic Treaty and sets the course for NATO for the next decade. The NATO military strategy is a military committee strategy that in turn recently was operationalized through two high-level strategic concepts. One is secures deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, or DDA, and the other one is SACT's NATO Warfighting Capstone Concept, or NWCC. That concept describes how the NATO military instrument of power should be developed over the next couple of decades. And from the NWCC springs a number of lower-level concepts, the multi-domain operations concept, layered resilience concept, and the concept that I'll be presenting to you today, the cognitive warfare concept. Now, concepts usually describe new capabilities, and once these capabilities are developed, their use is described in doctrine. So the doctrine comes after concepts. The NWCC and DDA have already resulted in massive changes in our capstone doctrine, the AJP-01, which is currently being ratified by nations. And this, in turn, will drive changes throughout the whole doctrine hierarchy, including a new doctrine at the keystone level, the AJP-10. Now, this diagram depicts the information environment, and it's taken from the new Stratcom doctrine. And just in case not everyone is familiar with this construct, it's best described as a lens through which we view the operational environment from an information perspective. The information environment is divided into 3 dimensions: the physical, virtual, and cognitive dimensions where effects occur. Now, the cognitive dimension is, of course, nothing new. It is arguably the most important dimension because this is where decisions are made and where wars are ultimately won and lost. Military strategists since Sun Tzu have highlighted the importance of deception, will, knowledge, decision-making, and similar cognitive aspects of warfare. Since then, technological developments have amplified the importance of information in our security environments. And information is a resource that is and will increasingly be used to destabilize countries, in particular democracies, that are exposed through our openness. While they're not new, disinformation activities, fake news, conspiracy theories, and so on, are used to fragment and polarize public opinion and directed towards our alliance and our member states, turning our democratic values and freedoms into vulnerabilities. They exploit and weaponize fissures and polarization in order to undermine trust, cohesion, and negatively impact the societal resilience, thus representing a great risk to NATO. What is new is the hyperconnectivity of our population and the pervasiveness of information that is now being leveraged by our adversaries. This growing availability of personal data and other data expose new vulnerabilities for social and cognitive engineering using documented ways of changing human behavior unconsciously, or subconsciously, sorry. We've seen how this is done for commercial purposes, so it should be no surprise that our adversaries are also leveraging the same types of techniques to their advantage. Now, combined with emerging technologies, this gives autocracies like Russia and China new tools for information control, manipulation, and disinformation. As you all know, since 2008, and maybe before, Russia has been developing a strategy to undermine the cohesion of the alliance. And in Ukraine, Russia has systematically used all its instruments of power, including, of course, the military, but also all the others like diplomacy, economics, and information to achieve its goals. Now, as Kirjal said yesterday during his panel, Russia has suffered tactical and operational setbacks in the information environment, but their strategic long game remains the same. And we must not allow ourselves to become complacent because the Russian narratives are still finding fertile soil around the world, including in our own democracies. So, to counter this and to shape the information environment to our advantage, NATO must build its cognitive resilience as an alliance and also help nations to build their own resilience. We need to strengthen our own cohesion and have our own strategy to master the cognitive dimension in order to defend against adversarial actions, to gain strategic advantage, and to generate the effects needed to safeguard our deterrence and defense posture. To maintain advantage, preserve freedom of action, and actively defend unfettered decision-making, HQ SACT is therefore developing this concept. First of all, let me stress that NATO is, of course, a defensive alliance, and we're framing cognitive warfare as adversarial, malign actions that we need to defend our society's forces and missions against. This raises many questions that this community is probably very familiar with, like how to guard against such attacks, how to detect them, how to attribute them, and how to react. So we're seeing a lot of parallels to the long process that the cyber community has been going through over the last decades. Now, in order to defend, we must first understand the threat, and it's our belief that this threat is evolving. Some people ask if it's not just Stratcom or PsyOps, but we believe that with the emerging technologies and new sciences, that it is more than just that. You may have heard the term cyber-enabled information operations or influence operations over the recent years. I believe it's been discussed in CyCon before. However, we think that the threat presented is bigger than that, especially when we look at the time perspective of 10 to 20 years, like the NWCC does. So we believe the medium to long-term future threat to the cognitive dimension is not just cyber-enabled, but more broadly technology-enabled. And we believe that the confluence of certain technologies and sciences might create a paradigm shift for malign influence, potentially multiplying the adverse effects we're already seeing in our societies. Now, looking at the next couple of slides, please keep that 10 to 20 year horizon in mind, because some of it might seem a little bit like science fiction. And it's important to note that these are just a couple of examples of potential developments that might affect this space. Also, I want to stress that while our own capabilities might use some of these tools, our adversaries, of course, continuously show that they go way beyond what NATO's ethical, legal, and moral boundaries are. And to mirror the transparency discussion from earlier in the conference, how NATO operates in the cognitive dimension is clearly described in publicly available doctrine. So, what kind of technologies are we talking about? Let's start with the most obvious. These are TTPs that we've already observed over several years. Now, our own Stratcom structure is already starting to leverage some emerging technologies like AI and data analytics in the Information Environment Assessment Capability, or IEA, that's currently being developed by NATO. IEA will provide detailed analysis of the information environment in order to support coherent and successful strategic communication and contribute to the alliance deterrence and defense. Our adversaries are combining this with data mining of personal data, allowing them to perform highly targeted campaigns, or so-called micro-targeting. The data provided provides deep insight into the psychology of targeted groups and individuals, and is exploited to change attitudes and behaviors. The Cambridge Analytica data scandal from a few years back is, of course, a highly emblematic example of this. Sorry. There we go. A more recent addition to the flood of data comes from the emerging field of wearables. Now, probably you all, or most of you, have smartwatches, but there are other types of wearables as well. And increasingly, they are gathering physiological data about us, and this opens the door to targeting individuals at the exact time where they're most vulnerable to influence. For instance, when you're tired, hungry, angry, or happy, or whatever, you're much more vulnerable to influence. And if an adversary can tap into this kind of data, they're much more likely to be able to achieve their intended effects. Now, if this data is properly protected, and we all know from history that that's not always the case. Might not be easy to utilize this for mass influence, but it's certainly within the realm of the possible that our adversaries might use this for high-value targets. Now, this might look familiar to some of us after last night, where we got a bit of a taste of virtual reality. The emergence of the Metaverse as the next generation of social media bears with it the promise of a highly immersive experience, almost like living in a video game, if you will. I don't know how long it will take for Meta and other companies to realize this, but it is an enormous growth industry, and I'm sure that Meta and others are working hard to make it a reality as soon as possible. Now, seeing how traditional two-dimensional, if you will, social media has enabled influence over the last decade, it's easy to imagine how much more, or the threat potential, if you will, of immersive experiences like this when it becomes broadly available. And it's an area that I think is of concern to many, and that I know is being researched quite a bit. You can imagine the metaverse being combined with deep fake technologies, and imagine how much more compelling a message would be if you received it during a natural conversation with a beautiful person that perfectly matches your Tinder preference, or maybe a person that you, or the fake virtual representation of someone that you highly respect professionally. Now, going deeper into the rabbit hole, we are getting to neuroscience. And if you're following this space, you will know that at this moment, neuroscience is actually enabling us read and write access to the brain and to cognitive functions. Granted, it's still relatively rudimentary, but the science now allows some patients long thought brain dead to communicate with their surroundings. And some of you might remember that a man that had been locked in for years woke up and asked for a beer. So that's my kind of guy. I'm sure you've also seen examples of brain-controlled video games and the like. Now, there are currently 3 major brain science initiatives run by China, the EU, and the US respectively. These are driving research, providing an exponential growth in our knowledge about the brain and cognitive functions. So what this does for us is that because we are starting to be able to read thoughts to a degree and emotions, it gives us the ability to measure cognitive effects. It also gives us the ability, once we have gathered data and knowledge, to start to model cognition and start to model the cognitive dimension. Then we're getting closer to using modeling and simulation much in the same way we are using for other disciplines in the military, enabling experimentation, wargaming, and so on. And this will be of paramount importance to boost our understanding of the dimension. So there are also several research efforts that look into the possibility of cognitive enhancement. And as part of the concept effort, we're sponsoring a study by the NATO Industry Advisory Group, or NIAG, that will present possible military applications for cognitive enhancements to protect and improve our decision-making, as well as other applications like PTSD and traumatic brain injury recovery. Now, The NATO Science and Technology Organization, or STO, also has several efforts to identify needed research to advance our understanding of cognition and to advance the development of defense against cognitive warfare. Sorry. With neuroscience, as with other developments, what will distinguish us from our adversaries in this field is whether the science is applied in accordance with ethical, legal, and moral standards. And in NATO, we are 30 democratic nations, hopefully soon 32, that has to agree on these standards. Not so for China or other autocracies, of course, where open sources tell us that they are conceptualizing the weaponization of neuroscience for military purposes to target the brains of their opponents. And that brings us to the end of our science fiction-esque tour with Havana Syndrome. I don't know if you're aware of that. Certainly those of you from the US know, because it's in the news all the time. But what we're seeing is a quite large number of cases, approximately 130 at this point, in US embassies around the world, where people are experiencing debilitating headaches and other symptoms affecting the brain, causing sick leave, retirements, and reduced work performance. Now, this has not been attributed to any state actor, but it's suspected that it is caused by adversary states using directed energy weapons with either microwaves or non-audible sound waves. Now, this is, if it is a capability, it's causing both physical effects that causes, or if it affects cognition, but it's also spreading fear and uncertainty in the US intelligence and diplomatic community, which is, of course, a cognitive effect in and of itself. And if it's caused by intentional acts, they are likely to be further developed and potentially used also on the battlefield. So, having taken a brief look at some potential future threats and opportunities in the information environment, let's bring it back to the concept and the problem space that we're exploring. We need to increase our understanding of the information environment generally and the cognitive dimension specifically. The IEA capability I mentioned earlier will take us in the right direction through analysis of the media space, of sentiment analysis, and so on, but it will also increase our knowledge of psychological, anthropological, sociological factors, to name a few. The evolution of neuroscience that I was talking about also gives us hope that we will soon be able to start developing models to increase the value of training and exercises and experimentation. So, secondly, we have a strong bias towards effects on target audiences in our doctrine and practice. And we need to start defending our societies, forces, and missions against malign influence in a much more concerted way. We need to build cognitive resilience through education and training on topics like critical thinking and media literacy, of course, and other relevant topics that especially some nations in the alliance have more knowledge about than others, because you have been exposed to this type of activity for a long time. Now, we need to create a coherent approach to cognitive defense, and we believe that there are many parallels to the challenges the cyber community have been facing for years. As I mentioned, we need to sort out how to detect, attribute, and react to these kinds of attacks. And we'll need to figure out how to share threat information. And we, of course, also need supporting legal and policy frameworks. Thirdly, even though the importance of the cognitive dimension has been recognized over millennia, it's a really hard sell. One, it's complicated. Two, it's intangible. And three, there is no big fancy hardware or anything that goes boom, which of course makes it hard to sink money into this. Fourthly, the hybrid nature of these threats is causing the usual and of course intended headaches with unclear roles, responsibilities, and authorities between different parts of government and instruments of power. Keeping actions below the threshold of armed conflict is posing strategic dilemmas to our democracies that don't want to sort of cross established boundaries. Finally, ethical and legal and moral aspects. There are several questions that needs to be asked in this space, and we have a supporting study led by our legal office and the Shapes legal office that will investigate several dimensions of this. One is that many of the limitations we're facing is imposed by policy rather than law, so there is a potential for movement there. Other things that needs to be established is thresholds. Where do we put them in terms of reacting? Another issue, of course, is that we fight by different rules than the adversary because we're not willing to compromise on our values. Okay, finally, the cognitive warfare concept will propose how NATO can effectively increase the cognitive resilience of our military instrument of power, but could also be applied to our societal resilience. The concept will provide a framework for NATO to develop the military instrument of power by appreciating the implications of the cognitive dimension for the alliance. Warfare development and its adaptation through defense planning, capabilities, and doctrine. The goal is to recognize, respond, and repel cognitive threats under appropriate ethical and legal frameworks that is agreed by all NATO nations. The cognitive warfare effort will position NATO to seize the initiative in the cognitive dimension and ensure the alliance is prepared to defend against any cognitive attack from aggressors. Thus, we will ensure NATO maintains its warfighting advantage and safeguard its freedom of action to protect our way of life and offer security from assertive authoritarian actors and extremist ideologies. So I will conclude by saying that while empowering ourselves in the information environment and the cognitive dimension, NATO must never surrender our principles and values. When Russia seeks to disrupt and confuse the narrative, and China seeks to control it, NATO must speak the truth, as we have been doing during the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, to great effect. So, thanks for your attention, and thanks for the opportunity.